We're going to continue our series that we're calling Rooted in Galatians. So we're going to be in the book of Galatians, chapter 2. And we're going to begin in verse 11. We're going to do just a little bit of review of the first 10 verses in chapter 2. But we're going to make some ground today we're not going to finish chapter 2 today. But we're going to make some progress, and we're going to talk about the works of the law. Amen. Wow, finally, somebody's talking about this. All right, so last week we established that Galatians chapters 1 and 2 really speak about three main thoughts. So we talked about these three main thoughts. This week I was meditating and studying more. And I never I never give these three thoughts where they were related to each other, but I always like to wrap things up in a way that makes sense, that summarizes everything. And I realized I didn't do that, and I'm still a work in progress. I'm still studying. So we talked about these three thoughts, but I'm thinking that, and I'll repeat the thoughts in a moment. But I'm thinking that they do actually have a title, and they have a theme, these three thoughts, which is actually the truth of the gospel. Paul keeps mentioning this phrase over and over in these two chapters. He says, I didn't yield to the pressure so that the truth of the gospel may remain with you. Amen. The truth of the gospel. And it dawned on me when I was reading these three thoughts that I am talking, these points are all about the truth of the gospel. And so, for instance, we have the first one is that the gospel is the work of the Son, not the work of the law. The gospel is the work of the Son, not the work of the law. Number two is that the gospel is according to the will of God, not according to man. We studied a little bit this word according to, this phrase according to, comes from a Greek word, kata, that literally means to come down from or to originate with. So the gospel originates with God, not with man. Now, why is that important? Well, because the problem in Galatia, in these congregations in this region of Galatia, which, by the way, is in what today is actually Turkey. The problem with them was that there were people coming and preaching that Gentiles could not be saved unless they convert to Judaism. But this message originated geographically, it came from Jerusalem, but it really came from Jewish rabbinic authorities. So I don't think it was any specific rabbi that was teaching this, but I think people who had come to at least profess faith in Yeshua, who had been trained as Pharisees, kind of didn't see a clean break from being under the rabbinic authority, but they thought that there was a continuation there. And so when they developed this mix of theology of Yeshua plus the authority of the rabbis, then one or the other is going to take over. And for these people, the authority of the rabbis took over. So they saw that it was necessary for Gentiles who had come to faith in Yeshua to convert to Judaism. And we're going to see today exactly why they saw that, why what was the point why they thought Gentiles needed conversion. The third thought that we talked about last week was that the gospel is about the glory of God, not the glory of man. And this is important too, because Paul says, listen, I am not trying to please man. I am not seeking the favor of man like I used to do. He admits he used to live that way, trying to please rabbinic authorities. But he says, I don't do that anymore because I am a servant of God. If I were seeking the approval of man, I wouldn't be a servant of God. But implied in that is that those guys, they were indeed seeking the approval of rabbinic authority. And because they were doing that, they were actually not servants of Messiah. And you realize that the word servant in the Greek is actually slave, in bondage. So these people were actually in bondage to rabbinic authority. Paul had been freed from rabbinic authority. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that Paul was not a Jew anymore. I'm not saying, in fact, he says in the book of Acts, I am a Pharisee. That was possible, to continue to be a Pharisee and yet break with the authority of the rabbis. You know who did that first? Yeshua. That right, when they asked him, why don't you teach your disciples to wash your hands according to the customs of the elders? He refused to do that. He refused to put himself and his disciples under the authority of Jewish tradition. And there are reasons for that. So the gospel, the truth of the gospel is that the gospel is the work of the Son, not the work of the law. It is according, or it originates with God, not with man, not with rabbinic authority, not even with the apostles, right? He says, they contributed nothing to me. Speaking of the apostles. And the gospel is for the glory of God and not for the glory of man. We're not seeking to please man in the favor of man. So Galatians 2:3. In this section, he is speaking of thought number 2, when he is speaking of that the gospel is not according to man, but according to God. That it originates with God. It says, verse 3, but not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. This word compelled is very important, right? They didn't put pressure on Paul to circumcise Titus. Of course, you understand that when they talk about circumcision here, they actually mean conversion. Conversion to Judaism. It's the whole package. It's like when your teenage son, I'm speaking about me, right? When my teenage sons ask for the keys, can I have the keys? They're asking for the car, really, right? They don't just want the keys, they want the car. Well, that is actually a figure of speech, right? By which you call the totality of a thing by one of its characteristic parts, right? So you call the whole car by the key, but you really mean the whole thing. Well, here, circumcision really means the whole thing. It means conversion. And the problem with conversion is that when a person converts to Judaism, and this was even more so back in the first century, what you are declaring is, I take upon myself the yoke of the rabbis, the yoke of the authority of what they say, their rulings, their teachings, their legally binding decisions. I place myself under that authority. Big decision. And so he says that when I took Titus, even though he was a Greek, he was not compelled. Nobody was putting pressure on us to circumcise him, to put him through conversion, right? Verse 4, but it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, our freedom, right? Not slavery, but our freedom, which we have in Messiah Yeshua, in order to bring us into bondage. What bondage? The bondage of being under the authority of the decisions and the rulings of the rabbis. Verse 5, but we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour. So that the truth of the gospel, there is that phrase, right? The truth of the gospel would remain with you. The truth that the gospel is according to the work of the Son, is according to God, and is for His glory. But from those who were of high reputation, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Well, those who were of reputation contributed nothing to me. Meaning the apostles, the other apostles, James and John and Peter, they didn't find the message that I preached to the Gentiles. They didn't find it lacking anything. The gospel I preach is complete. It lacks nothing. That's what Paul is saying. Not even the apostles have anything to add to it. And the passage goes on to say that they gave Paul and Barnabas their right hand of fellowship. Full acceptance, right? We approve the message that you're saying, that you're preaching, is the same that we are preaching. The gospel to the Gentiles and the gospel to the Jews. How is it the same and how is it different? Well, to the Gentiles, Paul and Barnabas were saying, there is only one way to come into the blessings of the new covenant of Israel, the blessings promised to Israel, and that is by faith. That's the only way to come in. And to the Jews, Peter and James and John were saying, there is only one way to come into the covenant blessings of Israel, and that is by faith. So you realize that they're telling Jews, it's not because you're sons of Abraham. It's because Yeshua said, I can raise sons of Abraham even from these stones. So, I'm sorry, it was John the Baptist, right? God can raise sons to Abraham. It's not because you're sons of Abraham. So it's not because of Jewish status. But the false gospel says, Gentiles, you need Jewish status. And Paul says, not true. Not the true gospel. Salvation is not based on you having Jewish status, whether for Jew or non-Jew. And that's the truth of the gospel. So then in verse 11, it says, but when Cephas, or Kepha, his name in Hebrew, when Kepha came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Now remember Antioch is the place where in Acts 13, Barnabas had brought Paul to be part of the teaching team, be on the staff, right? Cool. And Acts 13 names several guys that were the leadership. Great teachers there. And Barnabas and Paul were there. And that's when the Spirit spoke to them and said, okay, it's time for Barnabas and Paul to be sent out and preach the gospel to the nations. So this is a very strong congregation, this congregation in Antioch, and it's full of Jews and Gentiles. And Peter comes to minister there, and we'll see he's eating with the Gentiles, right? It says, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For prior to the coming of certain men from James, this is from Jerusalem, this is James, the brother of the Lord. I don't believe that James sent these guys. I don't believe James believed this message, because we see James in Acts 15 clearly saying the Gentiles don't need to convert.
Right.
So these guys, like Paul says, that they were brought in secretly to spy out our liberty. So I think these guys are calling, they're throwing around the name James. Yeah, we're members of Sukkat Shalom. We came here in the name of Joey. And it's like, really? Because that's not the message they preach over there at Sukkat. So you, under false pretenses, really, they say they came from James. But look, it says that Peter used to eat with Gentiles. And of course, naturally, the mind thinks, oh, Peter was eating ham sandwich. because he's eating with Gentiles. Right? And the law is abolished. So, good for you, Peter. Plus, Peter had that vision. Remember that vision? All these unkosher animals coming in, unclean animals. And after that, he started eating that stuff. Right? That's what you read in every theological book or commentary, and every preacher you find on YouTube, that's what they're going to say. How can they all be so wrong, right? Well, let's see. Because here's the thing. Let's keep reading, and then we'll go into a little explanation here. It says, but when they came, these guys that claimed to be from James, Peter began to withdraw and hold himself aloof, fearing the party of the circumcision. It was fear. Peter needed a little freedom. He was operating under fear. Why was he afraid? What was he afraid of? And we'll get into that a little bit. The rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy. Wow. This is not a small thing. Remember, these are the leadership of the congregation in Antioch. These were great guys. They were strong in the Lord. Look, it says that, but when I saw, 13. The rest of the Jews joined in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. Barnabas, who had seen, along with Paul, the salvation of all these Gentiles, and the Spirit of God coming upon them, just like Peter saw, and baptizing them without them needing to convert. So this is huge. 14. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel. There we have the phrase again. The truth of the gospel. They were not straightforward. That phrase, straightforward, in the Greek is orthopodeo. Orthopodeo. The word podeo, we get the word podiatrist. So this is about walking. It's about your feet, right? It's about walking. And the word ortho, we know this word too. Yeah, right? Orthodontist, right? Dentist, teeth, ortho, straight. So these guys were not walking straight. They were not walking straight. And look, it says about the truth of the gospel. Rather than saying about, it goes better if we say after. They were not walking straight after the truth of the gospel. Meaning they were not walking in line with the truth of the gospel. That the truth of the gospel, that it is by the work of Messiah, not the work of the law, from God, not from man, for the glory of God, not to pump up the rabbinic authorities. So Paul sees that Barnabas and all these great Jewish leaders, believers, were not walking according to the truth of the gospel. And he's going to do something about it. He says, I said to Kepha in the presence of everybody, if you being a Jew live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel Remember that word? That's the same word that was used with Titus, when they did not compel Titus to convert. But now Peter is compelling. Paul says, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? All right, we need to unpack some things here. Because this business of living like Jew, eating with Gentiles, being afraid of the party of the circumcision, we got to unpack this. This is the key to understand what's going on here. All right, so let's go to Acts 11 so that we can compare Scripture with Scripture and help us understand. So Acts 11, verse 1. Remember, this is now Peter retelling what happened in Acts 10, right? The vision coming down and then going to Cornelius. And so now he's going to retell this to the believers, the leaders back in Jerusalem. So it says, Acts 11:1. Now the apostles and the brethren who were throughout Judea heard that the Gentiles also had received the word of God. And when Peter came up to Jerusalem, those who were circumcised, this is important, those who were circumcised took issue with him. They had a problem with this. Saying, you went to a circumcised man and ate with them? Sounds kind of silly for us today, right? This is huge. Notice first that it says that those who were circumcised took issue with him. What does that mean? Listen, Cornelius was the very first one, non-circumcised, to be baptized by the Spirit. So Cornelius is way out there. It's just him and his family. He's way in the north part of Israel. Peter is now in Jerusalem. They were all Jews in Jerusalem. So why does it say those who were circumcised? They were all circumcised. What does that mean? And we read not only in Galatians, but in Acts 15, that these guys were the party of the circumcision. What I think this means is that these were the guys that were promoting submission to rabbinic authority for the Jews. So when it speaks, a large gathering of Jews, but it refers to a few as the circumcised, those who were circumcised, I think that's a reference to those who saw themselves in need of being subjected to rabbinic authority, and then later, when Gentiles are added, they are the same ones that are going to say the Gentiles need to be under rabbinic authority. They need to convert. They need to be circumcised. So that's the group that we're talking about here. So that in Galatians, when it says that Peter was afraid of those of the party of the circumcision, that's the identity of that group. Peter was afraid to displease those who were teaching that you have to live in submission to rabbinic authority. And I'll expand on that a little bit. Acts 10:28. So we're going back one chapter. This is when Peter originally had the vision, right? And this verse, everybody needs to know this verse, because everybody gets this vision wrong. This vision was not about eating. This vision was about people. It wasn't about unclean food. It was about unclean people. Look what it says here, verse 28, Acts 10:28. It says, and he said to them, you yourselves know how unlawful. This is Peter speaking to Cornelius and the group gather over there when he arrives. You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. And yet God has shown me a vision that I saw, right? He's shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. It wasn't about food. The food was just the props. It was just the metaphor. It was the object lesson. The real lesson was about people.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I want to read to you from rabbinic literature. Not very long. But this is the Tosefta. The very first part of Jewish tradition that was written down, remember it was oral, right? The very first one that was written down after the temple is destroyed, and they realized we have to write this down. We don't have a country and a culture to preserve this. We're going to lose this. So the very first that they write down is the Mishnah. About 400 years later, you have the Talmud. But in between those two, you have several other writings, but one of them is called the Tosefta. And so in the Tosefta, we read the following. This is Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, if a non-Jew prepared a wedding feast for his son and sent out to invite all Jews in his town, even if they have food and drink of their own, and have their own servant waiting at them, meaning the Jews, they worship idols. They worship idols. It's repeated. The phrase is repeated. They worship idols. They worship idols. He wants to make it clear, this rabbi, listen, even if you bring your own catering group, you're still worshiping idols by going to this wedding of non-Jews. It says, thus it is said, lest you make a covenant. He's quoting Exodus 34 verse 15. Lest you make a covenant with when they sacrifice to their gods, and when one invites you and you eat of his sacrifice. What's going on here? All right, this is very important. We're building up to be able to understand the phrase, the works of the law, right? So this rabbi is taking a verse of the Torah, and he is issuing a ruling. And he is saying that even if you taking this verse that says, do not make a covenant, do not partake of their sacrifices, you're going to end up marrying their daughters and their sons, and you're going to be tempted away from the Lord. It's Torah. But what he's saying is, I'm placing this commandment upon you. You cannot even attend. You cannot go into a wedding. You can't go into the house of a Gentile. And the reason is that everything they eat was offered to idols. So now we remember 1 Corinthians. Paul talks a lot in 1 Corinthians of eating or not eating food sacrificed to idols, and the weaker brother and the strong brother, and the idols are nothing, and there's a lot of teaching there. We don't have the time to get into it, but this was an issue. Because it was an issue in Judaism. And so this is an example, this ruling right here from this rabbi is an example of being under rabbinic authority. So it's the rabbi taking the teaching of Torah and going beyond what the Torah said. That you cannot even go into the house of a Gentile, you cannot eat any of his food. There are many other passages where, for instance, they would say, if you're sitting with a Gentile and you're drinking wine, and you have your jar, you pour your own wine, but then you go to the bathroom. I can't remember what they said. But then you go away, and then you come back. You can't drink the wine because it was out of your sight, and you don't know. He could have made a libation or a drink offering to his idols, and then, from your wine, and then you come and you drink of the same wine, and you're partaking of idol worship along with. So you see, it's going too far. It is true that idol worship is an issue, and that we need to follow the Torah to not worship idols. But the problem is that the rabbis will tell you, you are my disciple, you're under my authority, you got to do it the way I say. That's what it means to convert. That you place yourself under the authority under the teaching of rabbinic authority that may or may not go beyond the Torah, and you're obligated to it, and you become in bondage to it, because these rulings are going to be in the thousands. It's an ever-growing body of Jewish law. Okay, so what are we saying then? Number one, do you see the issue with eating with Gentiles now? So in the mind of Peter, these guys come and he's like, uh-oh, I used to live this way. Remember, in Acts, the Lord had to come down to him to teach him. He tells Cornelius, it is unlawful for a Jew to do this. This is how I've lived all my life. And by the way, the word unlawful is not anomia. Some of you may know this word. That word means to break the Torah or to be against the Torah. But that's not the Greek word here. Here it uses another word which means to break tradition. Because Peter knew exactly what he was saying. He's saying, it's against our tradition. And Cornelius knew because he's studying Judaism. He's on his way to convert when God interrupts and says, I'm here to accept you just the way that you are. And he's baptized with the Spirit. So he knows Judaism. So Peter can speak to him and he says, Jewish tradition, I'm not supposed to be here. But God taught me otherwise. Years later, now Peter comes to Antioch. These guys come from James, right, with this false message. And all of this comes back to Peter. And all of a sudden, he has this weak moment along with all these other Jewish guys. And they feel the pressure. We are Jews. We shouldn't be eating with Gentiles. They worship idols. And you know what? I'm just going to come to the Oneg. And I'm just going to say hi to a couple people. Hey, yo, hey. And then I'm just going to skip out. I'm not going to eat with y'all. And Paul was like, wait a minute. I know you, Peter. I know you love to eat and drink. I know you eat a lot. Are you telling, maybe last week you were fasting. Okay, maybe. Now, this is 3 weeks in a row. You're not eating with? What's going on here, Peter? Are you believing what these guys teach? We already did away with that. Are you placing yourself under rabbinic authority? You realize by you doing that, you're putting pressure on the Gentiles to do the same. With your behavior, you're conveying a message to them that they're not accepted. They can't have fellowship with you unless they convert, unless they put themselves under the same rabbinic authority to make sure that they have abandoned idolatry So now they're kosher. Is that what you're doing, Peter? And Barnabas, you now that I think of it, you're not eating with us either. And what about all of y'all? You know, they were from the south. What about all of y'all? You see, that is the essence of the works of the law. So now let me explain this. You realize I'm not done with my introduction, right? No, I'm gonna be done soon. I'm hungry too. I'm talking about food. And this is how okay. For nearly 2,000 years, nobody was able to understand what the works of the law meant. You couldn't. And I'll tell you why. Because when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it took them decades to put all these fragments together and realize, okay, this goes with that, and okay, now we have a complete message, kind of sort of complete because they're missing pieces here and there. Now we can translate this. Now we can see what this says. So and they were able to separate documents. You know, okay, this is one thing that goes together, this goes together. And so they finally come up with one of these documents, and they translate it, and they realize, okay, this thing, I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to read you a piece of this. It says, "Now we have written to you some of the works of the law, those which we determine would be beneficial for you and your people." Please, you are hearing stuff from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They wrote these people who were down by the Dead Sea, isolated, away from the temple. They are more stringent than the Pharisees. They are far more, they consider the Pharisees liberals. So here's what they write this letter. So the leader of this group is writing a letter to another group to kind of lay down these are the requirements. If you want to be part of us, which you should want to be part of us, because we're the good guys, we're the ones that are right. Right? Everybody claim we are the ones that interpret the Torah and live out the Torah the right way. So if you want to be on the good side, you want to be with us. But if you want to be with us, we need to tell you how we observe the Torah. So this is how we understand that these commandments are supposed to be obeyed. So you got to do it our way, the way of our group. You can't do it any other way. I understand you may be a Jew, maybe you're a Pharisee. I don't care. You're going to go to Hell, because if you don't do it our way, you can't be saved. Really, that's the mentality, okay? So, by the way, we do the same.
Yes, we do.
Don't we? We are a Judaism. We do the same. If you don't receive Yeshua as your Lord and Savior, I'm sorry, I love you. You're a great person, but can I tell you? Right? So, now we have written to you some of the works of the law, those which we determine would be beneficial for you and your people, because we have seen that you possess insight and knowledge of the law. Understand all of these things and beseech him to set your counsel straight. So keep you away from evil thoughts and the counsel of Belial. This sounds like a word for Satan, but it really is a way to describe some of the other, probably the Pharisees. So they will call the Pharisees the devil, really. And then it says, then you shall rejoice at the end times. They were very eschatological. You will rejoice at the end times when you find the essence of our words to be true. And it will be reckoned to you as righteousness. This is extremely important. Because they're saying is justification is by you obeying the Torah our way. Otherwise, you can't be saved. It will be reckoned to you as righteousness in that you have done what is right and good before him to your own benefit and to that of Israel. Did you catch the title of this letter? I'll read it again. Now, we have written to you some of the works of the law. And what comes after the part I told you, or actually before this, because this is actually the conclusion, this is the end of the letter. What come before was a list of about 20 things, and the scholars think that what's missing is probably another 20 of these specific ways of observing the Torah. Some of them are just straight from the text, and some of them is the same departure, the same going beyond, going too far in how they think it should be. But here's the point then. The works of the law is a particular group's rulings of how the Torah should be observed. And if you do not submit to their ruling, then you're out. Don't care if you're a Jew. You're not part of the true Israel. You will not be saved. You will not be justified at the end times. You have to do it our way. And we have specific ways of how you should do it. So Paul says, by the works of the law, no man can be justified. By placing yourself under rabbinic authority, accepting their halakha, their way of life, that's what halakha means, the way of walking out the commandments, that's not how you get into the blessings of Israel. Notice that it's not, the works of the law is not the Torah. The works of the law is the list that rabbinic authority will give you, their list of how they interpret the commandments, how they live them out. So you accept it and comply to it, and you can be part of us. That's why Paul is willing to die on this hill. This is life or death for him. This is not the gospel. The works of the law, placing yourself under rabbinic authority, under their rulings, is not the way to salvation. And that was their problem in that day. You see it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see it in the Tosefta, this rabbinic ruling. You can't eat with Gentiles because they worship idols. You have to do it our way. By the way, the apostles asked the Gentiles, Acts 15, abstain from meat offered to idols. They were not condoning idolatry. And they were asking the Gentiles, listen, go shop at the Jewish market. Don't shop where you know the food was offered to idols. Not because I think the idols are anything, but because some people think the idols are something. And so you don't want to give the impression that you too are part of worshiping idols. So he's asking the Gentiles, we want to ask you, but that's only 4 things we're asking of you. We're not imposing all of this rabbinic law on you. And so Paul rebukes Peter for the truth of the gospel. Not by the works of the law, but by the work of the Son. Amen. Amen. You feel a little more equipped? I know it's a lot. You may have to watch this a couple more times on YouTube. I understand. We're going to pick it up here. We're going to summarize it. We're going to keep moving into this book when I get back. But friends, we we as a congregation, we have a responsibility.
Amen.
We need to have answers. And the Spirit of God is ready to give answers. It's not like He can deal with these difficult texts. But we're called to be a congregation that is a blueprint for others. So we need to have these things straightened out. We need to have clarity in our theology so that our message is one of freedom and not confusion. Amen.